So good evening, everybody. My name's Mark Spevic. I'm the head of 3D course leader at Escape Studios and Houdini tutor. Oh, hi there, Joseph. And so I'm going to take you through this evening for the next hour, sort of give you an idea of what goes on the Houdini course. And we're going to do that through Groom. We're going to have a bit of the look at a little introduction to the Groom tools within Houdini. As you know, we've got a series of webinars in Houdini. I'm doing one a bit later on in a month or so, a couple of months, to do with fluid, sort of large and small scale water effects with Flip. So you might want to come along to that too. So just so you know, I'm going to give you an introduction to Houdini. So the idea of the taste today is to give you an idea of how the style of teaching is at Escape, and give you an opportunity to also ask questions about the courses, and also a little demonstration about some cool stuff that you can do on the particular software, in this case, Houdini. So you'll notice on the interface for Zoom here, you have a Q&A button and a chat button. It's better if you put questions in the Q&A, because those questions stay there and it's easy for me to answer them as we go along. If you stick them in the chat, they tend to get lost and I might not be able to get to your question. So please, so please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A. So the webinars, we're going to go through the little bit, and then I'm going to try and leave sort of 5 or so minutes at the end to answer any questions about the course. But of course, as I go through, if you want to ask any questions, please stick them in the Q&A and I'll do my best to answer them as we go. So I tend to answer the technical questions as we go, and I save the questions for the course and content towards the end there. So yeah, please ask questions. That's the important bit. So I might have to cut my video feed as we go because it's quite processor intensive, and trying to stream videos and run Houdini at the same time doesn't often work too well. So if my video feed goes, don't worry about that. You'll still be able to see my screen and hear me. Have I shared my screen? Yes, I have. So hopefully you can see my screen here. And hopefully you've downloaded the non-commercial version of Houdini, or you might have your own license, which will be absolutely fine enough. But what you want to do is, if you want to follow along, please fire up Houdini. And if you get left behind or you're a bit confused, please type in the Q&A and I'll happily pause or go over stuff to clarify. So let's start then. So I'm going to start with the default layout of Houdini here. And what I'm actually going to do is just pop up, click on this little arrow here. See the arrow goes upwards. That'll make this bottom pane large, just to give me some more real estate in the network here. So we're going to look at the Groom Tools, which are pretty awesome in Houdini. They've come in sort of the last few versions and really matured quite a lot. And they're fairly easy to use and get some interesting sort of sculpts. So I'm going to take you through some of the little techniques and major bits and pieces that you might be interested in to do that, to get you started. So the first thing I want to do is create some geometry, obviously, to make furry, to give some hair to. And as you saw from the flyer for the taste today, I'm going to be using the pig, the test geometry pig. So here at the object level, we can hit tab and we can type test to see all the test geometry here. And we can see our pig's head. So I'm going to pop the pig's head in. You don't have to use the pig's head. You can use whichever one you want. And what I'm going to do is I just want to modify this a little bit. So if I dive inside, we can actually see our pig's head geometry here. I'm just going to add another node. You can add nodes in Houdini by hitting tab and typing match size. And this is a nice new addition to Houdini, which will allow us to reset our object around the origin in specific ways. I'm going to tap P for the parameter pane, and this gives me the options here. And what I'm going to do is adjust the Y position here to the minimum of the bounding box, which is the bottom of the object. That means it now sits on the grid perfectly. So it's nicely aligned in the scene. For this example, it's not too important, but it's a nice thing to have a look at. I'm going to assume people have opened up Houdini before, because it's only an hour and I want to talk about the Groom rather than how to interface with Houdini or interact with it. So if you were to come to the course, obviously we go through the interface and all the buttons and the paradigm for procedural modeling and everything else. You really understand the differences between Houdini and other DCCs, digital content creation softwares. That's what DCC stands for. Things like Maya and Blender and yada, yada. Because Houdini works in a very, very different way, being a procedural software. But again, we explain those differences should you come along. So, but first we'll start with our test geometry pig's head. Now, unlike normal Houdini, where you'd normally go inside the network and do stuff in SOPs, the Groom tools are in fact inside SOPs, but we tend to interact with them mostly up at this object level. So that's what we're going to do. Now, fortunately for us as well, there's some really nice shelf tabs to help us with our hair or our guiding for the groom. And you'll notice there's three. There's this hair utilities, there's guides, and there's guide brushes. We're going to start with the hair utilities. And as we make it, I'll explain how Groom works. And it's the same whether you use XGen or Fuzzy Ball or you use Houdini's Groom. The principles are pretty much the same, which is good. So once you kind of develop some skills of grooming in one of them, you can easily apply those into the other softwares. They will have a very, very similar tool set, and they work in pretty much the same way. And the way that is as you can imagine, on a hairy head, you might have thousands and thousands of hairs. You really don't want to sculpt and move all those around. So we use guide hairs to do that. So we'll have a low res version, these guides, which we can manipulate, and those guides will generate the full groom later on. And that's true of pretty much most grooming softwares, because otherwise just trying to deal with all those fine hairs is almost impossible. So that's what we'll do. We'll create some guides first, we'll style the guides, and then we'll create a groom and we'll finesse the look. We'll try and do all of that in the short time that we have this evening. So the first thing I want to do is select my pig like this, and we can go up here and choose Create Guides. So I'm going to click on Create Guides, and it will select them to the selection here. And you'll see we've got guides all over my pig there. So I'm going to rename these guides to head hair, because we might have hair in different areas, and I want these specifically to be on the head. The problem is it's all over the head. We have a very hairy pig everywhere, which we don't want. We just want to localize it. I want to give him kind of a Mohican style, I suppose. So to do that, what I'm going to do is come down to, where are we? Down to here. We've got the density. The density here is where we can control how much hair that we see. At the moment, it's 394. It's fairly arbitrary, this number. But look, if I put something like 900, you'll see I got 3 times as much hair. So we want to pick a nice density for this to start with on the top of the head. So we might go for something like 2000. So we have a nice spread of guides here. So depending on the type of groom and style you'll do, depends on the kind of density of the guides that you'll want. And we'll discuss that a bit later on. Now, the problem is it's everywhere. I don't want it everywhere. So typically in Houdini, you could use groups to specify parts of geometry. But what I'm actually going to do is use attributes. So we can do that here on the groom node. Oh, if we scroll down a bit, you'll see that we have our density that we just adjusted. But then we have over here overrides. And here we can add overrides to control the density. So you've got 2 ways to do that. You can do it with textures that you've made in Photoshop and you bring into your UV geometry, or you can use it by using existing attributes on the geometry. We don't have any, but so we can create some. So I'm going to choose that, skin attributes. When I do that, it says, look, density attribute. So it's looking for an attribute called density. So we need to make one on our pig's head here. And where the value is 1, we'll get a density of 2000. Where the value is 0, we'll get nothing. And where we paint a value of 0.5, we'll get a density of 1000. So it basically multiplies by this density. So we can affect paint by painting exactly how much hair and where we want the hair. So I'm going to use it in a very basic way just to describe where the hair is going to go and a tiny bit of fall off. Now, again, this will automatically make the nodes for you. Traditionally, we'd make an attribute paint node for Houdini and do all of that. But if you come over to the right-hand side here, you'll see this little magic button. If you click on that, this will create all the nodes that we need to paint that attribute. And you'll see it's taken us inside the pig's head geometry. And it's created a density attribute here with this attribute create node, and then an attribute paint node where, if you look at attributes, we're painting into that density channel. And we can see it here in red, which means it's everywhere. And you can see, because we have the ghosting on here, if I turn it off and turn it back on, we can see what's happening at the level above, and therefore our guides. So we can see if the guides are working or not. Sometimes it's slow to update, so I'm just going to tap the Y key, which actually usually toggles on and off this button here. Why is that not toggling it on and off? Maybe it's because I'm in a brush. Let me try that again. So yeah, the Y key toggles on and off this ghosting view. So select the paint density node, and then over this 3D view, you can hit enter, which brings you back to the tool. So what I'm going to do is actually set the value to 0. At the moment, it's set to 1. And my mode is set to volume. What I'm going to do is change this to fill, which fills everything with the same value. And in Houdini's brushes, you'll see we've got foreground and background float. And I could background number, and the background 0. And I can use the background here by using the control key when I brush. So if I hold down control and left click, I fill the whole thing with a 0 value, and you'll see the groom has disappeared. I need to change the mode again, and we'll paint with a volume this time. Actually, we'll paint with a surface because it's more reliable. And you'll see we get a little surface brush. Now, if I click, I'm going to paint a value of 1. And as I do that, you'll see the hairs appear where I've painted. So we'll give him a little bit of a mohawk strip. And then maybe we'll have some Mohican hair come down to the chin there. Something like that. Excellent. Cool. And if we paint a little bit down here, we'll get some down there, but I'm not going to do that yet. We'll do that a bit later on. Another thing we can do is we can soften the edge here. You'll notice that the density, where it's red, we're getting the full 2000 density, but as we fade off the colors here, because this was a soft edge brush, you'll see the hairs get less and less dense, and sometimes you get a few rogue ones at the edge here. Again, you can shrink the brush down and with control paint your background color. You've got to hit the vertex because you're painting actually on the points. There we go. And that will remove, and you'll see those hairs have disappeared. And the same over this side a little bit. So we can finesse it a little bit. Something like that. Just make that come down a bit more. Maybe there. And another thing we can do is actually soften this and blur it if we want. Let's make that a little bit more even. So if you want to soften this, we can make the brush big. And then what we can do is, if you look here, it says if you hit shift, you can smooth the values. So I make that big enough, hold down shift and click. You'll see it just blurs everything. And that means the density just falls off a bit nicer towards the edge here. I'm going to hit escape to come out that tool so I can see where the hair is, and it goes down over the top. So we can paint those regions as we need to. I'm going to come out that network now. And we can see where that hair is. The other thing we can do with the guide grooms is we can actually set the length of them down here. So let me increase this length a little bit. In fact, I'm not going to do it there. I'll do it somewhere else in a minute. Now, once we've done that, we can come in here and start to finesse things. So I said I wanted to edit the length, but I don't want to do it up here because I can get more control from inside. And to do that, we can use one of these other things here. So the first thing you do when you do a groom is work out where you want it and where you don't want it. The next thing ideally you want to do is set the length of the hair. So it's all the right kind of lengths that you want. And after you set the lengths for the hair, you then start to style it and move it around. So that's what I'm going to do next. Let me cut my video feed because my machine's going a bit chunky. It's going a bit slow. There we go. So I do apologize. You'll just have to hear my voice for a minute. So let's do that. And for that, we can go to these guide processes. These are nodes that can affect the guides themselves. And there's lots of stuff that we can do here. Things like setting the length, setting the direction, and other stuff like that. But the best thing to start off with really is to start off with the length. So let's click on here, set guide length, and that'll apply itself to the node we've got selected. And what you'll see here is actually we've dived inside that groom node, and we've added this node called a guide process node. In fact, there are all these nodes up here, all these options up here are the same node. You actually change the method here if you want to, so you can add that manually. And you'll notice it outputs three things. It outputs the guides, which is what we see, a skin, which is the geometry, and a volume to represent the skin. That's how our hairs will actually collide with the pig's surface. So when we're grooming, things won't go inside the piggy. And again, you can see, because I've got the ghosting on, we can see the pig there. But if I turn the ghosting off, then that's just the groom that we've got, which is not so intuitive. So sometimes it's better to leave this on. So let's select the guide process here and let's adjust the length. So I can adjust it here by playing with the slider. So you can make that bigger or smaller as we like. So I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, something like this. And again, we can perturb the length with an attribute if we wanted to. So again, we can bring down here, click on skin attributes. And again, it's looking for an attribute called length. We could actually use that density attribute that we made. So let me type in density. And now the length's also affected by the density. And you'll see where the hair's less thin, or more thin rather, it's shorter. So we get this nice fall off where it's getting thinner and shorter and then building up in there. We could actually create, we could change the name here and then click this magic button and then paint in on top of that our own attribute. But I quite like doing it this way because then you get this nice kind of look where they match each other really. But it's entirely up to you how you want to manage that. And again, this map multiplies by this length value. So you can still change the length afterwards. This just multiplies with that. So you still get the same kind of fall off, just a taller hair if you want. So you can give them that kind of Mohican style there. Most important thing is obviously to save, because Houdini likes to, well, all software likes to crash. So just in case, especially when you're doing something processor intensive like this. Now that we've set the length, what we want to do is start to build some direction in this to start our sculpt off. And there's a few ways you can do it. One of the methods I like to use is to use this initialize guides. This doesn't really initialize it, basically just gives you another way to start off with an interesting direction. So I'm just going to click initialize guides. And it adds this guide initialize node. And what you can see, it's flattened all the hair back along his head. He looks like he's got gel or a slick back. Now, the way this works is it's basically got a direction here, and it's essentially like you're blowing a wind along the hair at this angle. If I grab the red line here, I can actually pull that angle up, and you'll see how it kind of blows the hair around. So we could blow it forwards like this and give him a funky look, or totally back. But the important thing is it gives us a nice, quick sort of style to work with there. Excellent. Let me save. So the next thing I want to do is start to build in a bit more movement into this hair. Should we make that a little bit longer? So let me just make this a little bit longer. This is the wonderful thing about procedural software, is you can always go back in time and change stuff. And look, you could even click on randomize, so we get random length values between these values. So we could just have it slightly irregular if you want. Let me just turn it off for a minute. It looks too untidy. That looks much neater. But again, that's up to you if you want to do that. So the next thing I'm going to do is use this tool here, Curve Advect. What this will allow us to actually draw directions we want the fur to go in. So let me click Curve Advect this time. And you'll see it adds a bunch of nodes, which we don't really need to worry about. All we need to worry about is sort of the radius of the tool. And this is how many hairs are going to be affected. And we're basically going to draw curves on that surface. So if I just click down the left-hand side here and off to the right, you'll see how it pulls the hair off with there. If I go off to the other side, I can widen it off that way too. So on the top here as well, you can kind of pull it around if you want, create a curve that way, or create another curve this way to give it a kind of a parting on the top. And it's really handy. Let's put another little advect there maybe. Does that one work very well? Let me make that a bit smaller. Maybe make this one over here. Maybe I need that one bigger actually. Something like that might work, just to pull it out at the top there. So we've got it really long and flat. Look at those hairs. They've gone a bit crazy, those guides. Oh no, those are my curves actually. Thought they were the guides there for a minute. So we can use the curve advect. So just to recap, I painted the density where I wanted it. I created a curve length to adjust the length and perturb that. Then we did an initialize to push it back, and then a curve advect, which allows us to draw the multiple directions that we want the fur to go in. And as you saw, it's very, very quick to get a really nice starting point. There's other ways that we can move this around. So let me demonstrate some of these other brushes to show you that. So if we click on brushes, these brushes will allow us to pull and paint these guides around in other ways to, again, extend or control more how you want the groom to go. So a good one to use is the screen brush. So if I click on screen brush, again, it's a little 3D brush here. And this one is a lot more localized. Look, if I just pull in here, you'll see I can just literally pull out little bits of the fur this time and get a much finer control. So you'll notice I'm doing the big shape first and then going in there and then adding in the smaller bits later. So I can kind of pull these hairs around the ear like this, just tease those around the ear. And you'll see because of this skin VDB, the volume, it's colliding properly with the mesh. So it knows that it should go around the ear there and not through the geometry. So again, we can do that around here. Just part these hairs that way. Maybe make the brush smaller. So I just pull that one. A bit bigger so I actually grab it. There we go. And then we can separate these over here. And again, it's about getting used to the tools and knowing which ones are going to help you do stuff. Maybe pull that up a bit, give it a bit more life, that kind of thing. And if we want to lift it up and give it a bit more life, because all those brushes have kind of flattened it down a bit, we can use another node called the lift. So this is the lift hair here. So the lift will basically just raise them up against the surface. So let's click on lift. Actually, I don't want to groom one. I want to process one. I don't want to paint the lift. I want to go to the process and do it more procedurally. So with the brushes, you kind of paint it in a granular way. With the processes, you kind of do it globally more. So I'm going to click on lift guides. And there you go. It's lifted them or raised them all up. And look, we can, there's a couple of things we can do here. We can actually fade with blend, and you've got blend with most of these nodes, is you can actually fade the effect in and off, on and off. So if I turn it off, that's our original, but I can slowly bring it back in just to raise up some of those hairs there. If you drop the contour here, this means it's going to follow the volume, but you can turn that off so it just lifts up randomly, or you can sort of randomize that lift to create a bit more life to it. But there's a better way to sort of create more variation to this a bit later on. Now, what's interesting about the lift, if I just pop the lift up high again, what we can do is we can actually, if you notice most of these processes, if I look at this one as well, you'll see there's a masking tab. We'll use this for the lift. The masking tab is really, really handy. What this does, it allows you to create this lifting effect or whichever effect you want, but to do it down the length of the hair. You'll notice the hairs are slightly darker at the base and lighter at the tip. And that's the mask that we're going to use. So we can have our effect fade in towards the tip or fade off towards the tip. It's up to us. So to do that, we can turn on use curve mask. And it's going to use the curve as a mask. And you see the base is still tight to the skull. But then as we come further away towards the length, it starts to rise upwards. And it's based on this ramp here. This is the base where there's no lift, and this is the end where there's a lot of lift. We could reverse that, for example. So we could have a lot of lift at the base and very little lift at the end. So it kind of lifts it up a little bit more and then pulls the style back down again. So it gives us that little bit more granular control over how that goes. And again, we can blend that in or blend that off accordingly. This kind of thing. And then we could add another curved vect or another brush and then keep refining it as much as we'd like to. Which I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it at that for the minute. Now, what I'd like to do is add a little bit, start to add a bit of life to this. In fact, let me just do, let's go back to another brush and give them a bit more of a lick at the front here. So I'm going to go to the, where is it, the screen brush. Let's go to the side view here, make that a bit bigger. And I'm just going to pull the front of this forward to give them that bit of the quiff that we see on the Mohican there. Let me do a bit more around the side, and we'll come that tapering off quite nicely as we go down. Let's bring down the strength. Actually, that's already in. Now, if you've gone wrong with your lift, you can up here hit reset strokes, and that'll just reset what you've just done. So let me just pull it up from the center here. Let's put up these little bits there and there. Let's go to the side a bit more. Let's pull up this. Oh, now we're missing that bit there. So let's pull those bits up as well. So you've got a bit more of a slick back going on. Oh, don't know why it did that. Cool. So we've kind of pushed up that nice slick back hair there. If you want to come back to any of these nodes, you can just select it and hit enter, and then you get back to the interactive handle for that particular brush. Let's just pull those down a little bit. Cool. What I want to do is add a little bit of life to these hairs. So there's another great node that we can use, and that's another one of these process nodes here. So instead of using the shelf, we could just add them in ourselves. So here we could type tab and then do guide process. That didn't do it. Tab, start to type guide process. There it is. And look, there's various ones here. Let's choose the frizz one. You'll notice when you drop it in, it automatically connects for you. And then we can turn on frizz. And you'll see frizz makes it frizzy. It creates these zigzags. Let's zoom into this hair, down the length. And that's adjusted by this frequency. Now, if you make it very high frequency, if I put a large number in here, you'll see at a certain point, it stops showing you that because we don't have the resolution. If I turn on the points, you'll see there's not that many points in each hair here. So because we don't have many points, I can't have very frizzy hair because it's only going to bend where the points are. If that's the case, you can actually come out back up to this guide groom here at this level, and you can increase the segments. Let me turn on the points. So the segments is how many points are in these curves. Let's put something like 16 in. And that should give us more points along the curve. Let me go inside. Let's just check that's coming through. Oh, yep, that's a good point. Because we made a change up at the top level here, this change has not propagated through this network. So there's a good button that we can do to fix that. If we go to the hair utility, no, it's not, it's in, where is it? There you go, guide brushes. We can click this magic button here, recast strokes. Because in some of these nodes here, we painted strokes. You'll see that here in the draw curve, we made some strokes. Everything needs to be updated down the pipeline. If you click this button here, recast strokes, it forces any changes upstream to propagate all the way down. So if I click on that, there we go. We now get all those extra segments. Now we've got those extra segments, we can see those smaller curls in there. And now it looks a lot more, if I turn the points off, a lot more scraggly. So just to demonstrate that again, if I bring the subdivisions down to say 6 and click recache, we'll now see we don't have enough points to show that those high squiggles. If I put something like 16 in, hit recache up here, then you'll see we get the squiggles going down the length there. Which might be a little bit much. And again, we can use masking on that. Let me go inside and back to the guide process node here. So on the guide process node, again, we can use the masking, and we can use a curve mask again, so it happens down the length. And you'll see at the base, it's not frizzy, but as we get towards the tip, it gets frizzier and frizzier. And you can control this, as you saw, not just with the ramp, but also with this minimum and maximum range. So this is starting at 0, which is the bottom of the curve. I can actually say, start that ramp at the halfway point of the curve. So now you'll see there's no, well, there's the halfway, and then this ramp kicks in from the halfway point. So from halfway, the frizz fades in. If I bring this right up high, then we only get really frizz right at the top there. So we can bring down the range of the frizz like this. And again, you can bring down the top so that now the frizz is happening all the way down to the bottom if I bring the top down. And again, you can go back to, yep, you can fade that in and out with blend up here. So again, we can sort of fade in the kind of frizz that we want. So I'm going to put a little bit of frizz towards the end, maybe just very subtly, something like that, very small amount. Kind of okay with that for the minute. So let's see how that actually looks as a proper hair itself, and then I can come back and refine some of this. So I'm going to come out of that network, and this should not be showing it gray. That should be showing it properly. There we go. It just didn't refresh itself. So let's add a groom. In fact, before I do that, let's add a groom and then we'll talk about the issues you might get with it. So what we want to do is go back to hair utilities here. And then we'll click on this, generate hair. So I click generate hair. It says select the groom object you want. I'm going to select the groom here and then hit enter. And then it'll take a second to process. And then this hair gen node then calculates the hair around the grooms, around the guides rather. And there we can see our funky looking hair. It doesn't look great. There's some oddness going on, especially at the front here. It's not fading in very nicely, but there's some controls we can do about that. There's some things we can do to fix that. So we want to create some material for this so it's shaded. So to do that, I'm going to go to Houdini's material palette and look, here's a hair shader. Let me drag that over. And if I select that, we can see the settings here. There's loads of settings for it. We can change the color. We'll come back to rendering, hopefully in a moment. So let me go back to the object level. So here on the hair gen shader, I need to connect it here to the material. So let me click on there, open this up, and I can select my hair shader and apply it. And now we should see that in color. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to break this connection, which is fine. And you'll notice here, we can bring in a groom object up here. I'm just going to drag in my groom object to connect it that way. Now the color actually works. That's a slight feature of Houdini. Maybe you'll call it a bug. But if you have this connected, for some reason, the shading color doesn't go through. So if you break the connection, that's fine. You can just plug in the guides that you want to generate the hair from. So now we see it in the color of the shader. If I go back to the shader here and select it, and then go back to here, I can obviously change the color, sort of have red hair or whichever color hair that we want. But I'm going to leave it at the defaults that we started with, revert to default. There we go. And you'll see it shades it from the base to the tip. So the base is a dark color and the tip is a much lighter color. You'll see that much clearer in the render, but you can see it's darker here and it gets a bit lighter as we go to the top. Now, the first thing we want to do is fix how these guides work to make it look a little nicer. So if we look at the actual hair gen node itself, it says it's using guides here. So we're using the guides that are plugged in up there. And we've got our own density control as well. So we can control how many of these little hairs will generate. And these are the ones that are quite slow. And you'll see they're picking up the frizz and the style from the guides that we asked for. And you can see where I had the less density and the less length as well. So the way it works is you take a guide. Let's have a look at this little guide here. And around the guide, we have a region of which it's going to scatter the hair. And that region is this influence radius. If I bring that down, you can see we can actually get quite tight to the guide there. But then it can make the hair look a bit more patchy, especially these outer edges. But the rest of it looks quite good there. So it's about finding the right size for this and then getting the right density. Now, when you've got problem areas like this, if we don't want hairs here and here, what you can do is actually go back into the guide, select the select tool here, and then right click on this bit and make sure you're on primitives. In fact, let me turn off the, would that help without the ghosting? Yeah, maybe. And then what you can do is select with shift the guides that you want to get rid of. So I'm going to select these ones and those little ones there, because they were causing some oddness. And I think we got those ones selected. It's a bit hard sometimes with the colors. Let's select that one as well. And then once you've got the ones you want to remove, maybe this one too, you can simply hit delete on your keyboard. And look, Houdini adds a blast node, which removes those primitives. So when we go up now, they're missing. We've got rid of them. Sometimes the painting's a bit fiddly. Look, I want to get rid of that one as well. So again, let's go inside here, select these. Maybe that little one under there with shift. I'm not going to spend too long. You can spend ages doing this. I'm not going to spend too long. So hopefully you get the idea. So we can come in there and we can start to finesse and remove any awkward guides that are ruining or making our groom look a bit odd. There's some down the back here, but there you go, that'll do. Let's hit delete. We got rid of those. Oh, might want to get rid of these ones here as well. So let's hit delete again. And let's have a look at how that groom looks. There we go. So we've tidied up those weird little roguey looking ones. I think the rest of that looks pretty okay. So we can easily go in after the event and just delete guides that are unnecessary. We don't need. Maybe get rid of that front one there and that one too. And again, if you decided you want to keep it, you can simply just disable the node and they'll come back again. It's one of the nice things about Houdini's proceduralism. The fact that it's very, very flexible. So if we come back up, that's looking a little bit nicer at the front there. We've got him his nice little Mohican. Very good. So there's another little effect. Let me just hide the guides, the display of the guides, so we can just see purely the groom there, which looks kind of funky. It's going around the ears as we want. So there's another thing that we really like to add. Let me increase the density actually. Let me put the density up to maybe 15,000. Maybe 25,000. So he's got a nice thick head of hair, unlike me. There we go. Doesn't look that great, but looks like a bad wig actually. But anyway, need to spend a lot more time on it. And what we can see is that the guides are affecting the hair here. And we're seeing a little bit of what's called clumping. Hair naturally clumps. It clings together with a bit of static. It also clings together because of a bit of natural grease in there. And you see this sort of clumping. It's not very uniform. And we can create that quite easily and get a very nice natural effect from it. So to do that, I'm going to actually do it on the groom. We can create clumping on the guides or actually on the hair itself. I'm going to do it on the hair here. Excuse me. So I'm going to go inside. And since we're in here, we want to look at hair tools. So I'm going to type hair and I'm going to use the hair clump. So if I just put that in, you can see what it does. It gives us an error because we need to plug in the skin here as well. And also, we should plug in our volume, skin VDB, into that last slot here. So skin VDB. Now that we've plugged those in, you can see what the clumping does. It clumps the hair together a bit more around those particular guides. And this will give us that sort of, greasy or matted natural look. So here we can play with the clump size. We can reduce it down, make it much smaller, so it looks more natural. And we can also increase the crossover rate. What that means is some hairs in one clump will suddenly jump over to a neighboring clump, which just breaks up the uniformity of it. And to break up the uniformity even further, make it look even more natural, we can click on fractal clumping. As soon as we start playing with the iterations, you want a reasonable number, you'll see it just starts to break up that irregularity in it. And you can tweak some of these settings to sort of make it seem, more nice, more natural or less natural, depending on your reference. And again, we can use attributes to paint this. So we can have different clumping based on either texture maps or painting as we go. So that should look hopefully a bit more natural, especially down the back here. We can see hair clinging together in certain ways, and that was the effect that we're after. So clumping's really good for that. So what time have we got? We've got probably about another 5 or 10 minutes. Time does fly when you're having fun. So what we'll do is we'll move on to the rendering, but I'll just recap the technique again. So you apply your groom, you then paint where you want it to be, the density. Then the best thing to do is adjust the length. Once you've adjusted the length, you can start to pull it around into shape. Once you've pulled it into shape, you can add the smaller details of the brush, like just pushing out extra bits that you want. And then the last bit is just to add the clumping on top, just generally, because you don't want to mess with any of that. And you can go back at any time and bring in your brush tool again and re-edit the guides, which will change the groom if you want to, that kind of thing. Just really is quite a quick start. So let's have a little quick chat about how we might render this. Let me just save it again. So you'll see it's very easy to do stuff. In fact, there's some other really cool tools that you can use. But yeah, let's get on with the rendering. You can cut it and do all sorts of wonderful things. Where's the cut gone? Is it there? So yeah, look, we can cut hair. This is an interesting brush. So I'll just demonstrate this one. So if you want to, wrong thing. So if you want to cut the hair, you can choose the cut hair brush. And look, literally, if you just click, it cuts it where you've clicked. So you can get really nice edges like that. Let me just undo that twice. So if I bring that down something like this, we'll see we can cut the shape of the brush in there. So generally this is quite good for getting those straight edges right across like this, like broom handles or that kind of thing. So I don't really want to cut anything. I just wanted to demonstrate it really because I quite like that one. And again, we could extend the hair. We could smooth out bits of the frizz with this. We can add a parting in there as well. This will part the hair for us. So, you know, you should check out a lot of these tools just to see how you might get in there. But the first thing you really want to do is set the length, set the direction with initialize, wherever that's gone, initialize and curve advect. And then you can start to do this more finer stuff like cutting and frizzing, and depends how much you want to work into that groom. So yeah, let's talk about the rendering. Let me save. So very quickly, I'm just going to find a nice angle, something like this. Control click my camera to drop the camera in. Just reposition that. And then I'm going to create a light source for him. So let's come up, where's the camera? It was there. Let's create a 3/4 light up here. So spotlight, let's drop one in there. Let's drive that over here. And then I might create a second spotlight around here to fill in these shadows. This is called a fill light. So drop a spotlight in there. You'll see that one's a bit bright, so I'm just going to reduce the exposure of the fill. So I've got control of the contrast. Let me look through the other spotlight. So I might just want to come around. Oh, let me look through that other spotlight. Just want to come around a little bit, so we've got a bit more lighting around the front. And then if we look through the camera, you can see our little piggy there. Let's come a bit more 3/4. So let's get a bit closer to the hair so we can actually see it. And the nice thing about lighting hair generally is lighting it from the back, or creating a rim light as we call it. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to look where the camera is like this. I'm going to create another spotlight. Let's bring that up like this. Make it a bit closer and a bit smaller. Let's bring the brightness down a bit. And we'll play with that backlight in a moment when we render. Let's go back through the camera. If you turn on this bottom display, you can see sort of the lights there. And I can bring down sort of my main key light if I want, and I can play with all the balances. In fact, I'm going to disable the key light and the fill light, and I can see totally what the rim light's doing. It's not doing what I want. Let me lift its interest up a bit. There we go. So it's coming down more on the top of the ears here and the top of the pig. Cool. So let's do a render and see how that looks. Let me turn the other lights back on. Otherwise, we won't see anything. So to render in Houdini, we've got to create a mantra node. So we'll go render, create render node, mantra. And I'm just going to make the res smaller so it works quicker. And if we go to the render view, let's just make these windows big. We can hit render and have a first look at how our hair looks. And again, we've got to understand how hairs work. You know, coarse hairs, like horses' hairs or things on a brush, they'll be quite thick and quite non-transparent, whereas things like cat's fur is very, very dense, very thin, and quite translucent. So fluffy furs have lots and lots of hairs that are very fine, whereas coarse hair has not so many hairs, but they're much thicker. And we can adjust all that in the shading. Now, this gives us an error because by default, it doesn't render, which is wonderful. What you need to do is click the actual groom here, go to render and say, use the actual geometry. So we'll use the curves in the scene. So let me hit render again, and now it'll be able to generate the fur curves for me. So you must remember to turn this on, otherwise you won't see your groom. So I'll give it a second now to calculate all those hairs. And we can change various stuff here in this hair generate. For example, we can change the thickness of the hair on how it appears in the render. We can adjust the density as we saw before. And we can affect also, we saw the radius already. So there we go. There's my pig being lit. Let me just bring down the brightness of the front light so we can see it being backlit a bit better. There we go, see the rim light kicking in there, making the hair glow at the top, which is quite nice. Let's get a little bit closer. I'm just going to hold down Shift and left click and drag to make a render region. That means this bit will render a little quicker. We can kind of see how the hair is looking. And you see it's quite shiny. So again, we can come here and we can go to thickness and we can make it a lot less thin. So let's do 0.1, so it's half as thick. So it looks much finer and not so coarse. And again, because it's much thinner, the hairs, it looks like we can see through them more. The thinner the hair, the more density you need to make up for it. So I'll go back to density here and then maybe double the density. Let's go to 4 instead of 2. Because I don't want to see the ear through the hair there. So it'll take longer while it generates that more hair, more density. And there we go, we're filling in the gaps with our finer hair again. So I will just want to tweak the shader a little bit. I can click this little arrow here and that'll take me to the shader. It didn't that time. There we go. Sorry, it's this one here, matte hair. So let me click this arrow. That'll take me to the shader. And here we could adjust the color if we wanted. So it's going from this sort of dark brown to light brown, but it's got a lot of sheen on it here with this sort of reflection. If we turn off the secondary reflection, you'll see we don't get that sheen, but hair naturally has that. So we'll turn it back on. What we can do is just reduce the intensity. Let's bring that down a little bit. So it's not so pronounced, but it's still there a little bit. So he's got a bit of gloss in his hair. So if hair is shiny, it means it's very smooth. Your actual hair fibers are made of scales. And depending on the roughness of those scales depends on your hair type. People with really silky hair have very smooth scales. People with rough looking hair have very rough scales. So when you've got unkempt hair, it's because you've probably got rough hair. And you can tell by when you wash it whether it comes out shiny or not really. And everybody's different, but that's the kind of controls that we've got with this sort of intensity, suggesting the roughness of the hair. If we go back to primary reflections again, we can also bring down the reflections generally overall on the hair. But the secondary one's the nicest one, I think. We can also add a bit of a reflection shift, which just adds a little bit of color difference, but which we might not notice here. And we can go to randomness as well and add some randomness to the cut to the hairs. So for example, we can change the hue. So the hue is sort of the color, so it can go from browns or reds or whatever. So we've got a very small difference in hue here. If I put a big difference in hue, we'll start to see hopefully some rainbow colors in there. Let's make that even bigger. Let's make that 1 and 1. There we go. We're seeing much more variation in the hue of the color. So we're seeing purples and blues and everything, which is kind of interesting, but not what I want. What I want is just a very subtle difference between the browns, something like that, 0.05. There we go. So there's a small variation between the browns. We can also add some randomness to the saturation of the hair. So you can desaturate it so in parts. And you can also add some randomness to the diffuse brightness and also the reflections. That's the specular intensity. It's also known as the reflections. So you can do some very, very nice stuff with it. What other good controls are there? The root to tip blend. This is how the colors fade off along the length. And you'll notice we've got use white hairs turned on. If I turn that off, then they'll all be dark. So the use white hairs just creates some random natural white hairs within there. Oh, actually, we haven't got them on. That says use white hairs. What we need to do is actually create that. If I click on this button here, add white hairs, it'll add a few random white hairs in there. So you can suggest that there's a bit of age in the character. So, you know, rather than all just all jet black, they're going a bit gray in certain areas. Now, in order to see that better, we really should increase the resolution. So let's go 2/3 resolution. Get a little closer. In fact, let's go full resolution. So we can just see what's happening up here. It'll obviously take a bit longer, but we can see those finer hairs in much more detail now. Cool. So that's kind of shading nicely. One last little trick I want to show you is we can actually add some dynamics to this. If the pig moves, all that hair will move with him. But also if I add dynamics, it will just make it naturally fall with gravity as well, which will just make it seem that bit more natural. And it's very easy to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the guides here. Let me turn that off and turn the guides on, because we add gravity to the guides here. So up here, I can go back to the hair utilities, and I can choose simulate guides. So that'll apply to the guides that I've selected. And it uses Houdini's vellum software, which is great for animating curves or cloth or all those wonderful things. And there we go. We can see our guides now have become blue, as we're now going to simulate them. So if I press play on the timeline, you'll see they all sync with gravity and they bounce off the head. They collide with the head there. Looks a little bit flat, a little bit too greasy. But the thing is, it naturally now hangs around the ear and down the back of the head there, but not quite matching my groom. So there's a few things we can do. We can add some stiffness to this. Now, the default settings for this are kind of interesting. They're for speed, not necessarily accuracy. So in order to really see vellum working properly, we need to increase the sub-steps, and that's here in the vellum solver tab. You need to put, let's put, say, 3 sub-steps in. It does slow it down, but if you look, it doesn't really have much of an effect because we need to put some stiffness in. Let me put that back to 1 to show you how it works. To put some stiffness on this, and we go to vellum constraints. And the hairs themselves have either a stretch stiffness, which stops them stretching, and they have a bend stiffness, which stops them bending. Let's increase the bend stiffness. I'm going to put in 10,000. Generally, you need quite high numbers. If I press play, it doesn't seem to have an effect, or just subtly. Whereas if I increase the sub-steps now to 3, see, it has more of an effect. It doesn't flatten so much. If I put the sub-steps to 5, it's able to work out those collisions more. And look, it's slightly more stiff. It doesn't fall so flat. I'm going to make it even less bendy. Let's add another 2 zeros. Still going quite flat. Let's add another couple of zeros. There you go, that's sagging down a little bit nicer. That kind of thing. Once you're happy with that, what you can do is turn on freeze frame. Unfortunately now that's going to run up to frame 50 to be my freeze frame. There we go, on frame 42, 44, 50. So now it's locked at frame 50 from the gravity. Now I can move the slider and it's not going to change anything. Now I can actually turn on my fur and see the result of that after the sim. Let me hide those guides. So there it is, flattened down as if with gravity as well. So you might want to create effects like that. Obviously, if this is animating, you don't want to turn on the freeze frame so that this will pick up the animation as he swings his head around and all the hair will move appropriately. So if we go to the render view now, let me save this image by making a snapshot. And we can render again and see what it looks like after gravity has been applied. And again, it's up to us if we keep that. We can turn it off or do another version or mix it in, that kind of thing. Cool. So that's pretty much it for the introduction to the Groom. It's quite a lot to cover in quite a short time, just under an hour on these webinars. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of tools, but they're really easy to use. You literally can just click on the shelf tools and play with them. And it's fairly interactive and artist friendly. And as long as you've got a good methodology, and like I said, the methodology is paint the density where you want, set the length, push it back with a big form like with the advect, and then go in with the brushes and put in the small details later. Much easier to work that way. And at the very end, clump it up to give it that naturalness. So if you do those kind of steps, you'll find yourself being able to get to grooms a lot faster than just messing around otherwise. So there's before gravity, after gravity. And the other little trick is hair always looks wonderful when it's lit from behind. It just looks so much more interesting. So if you look in all movies, they tend to rim light or backlight people for that reason. It just makes it look much nicer. So if I just hit shift and left click away, I'll be able to render the entire piggy there.